Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted this evening to host this talk from Anna Kreckler from the Rijksmuseum. But I'm just going to hand over to her and over to you, Anna.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Well, thank you, Claire, for the invitation and also the introduction. Well, brick by brick, the study of Pieter de Hooch's painting technique, and that is the title of my talk today. And in the framework of the monographic exhibition Pieter de Hooch from the Shadow of Vermeer, that was held at Museum Prinsenhof in Delft in 2019-2020, research was conducted into the artist's biography, his artistic development, the topographical accurateness of his compositions, the development of his fame with art collectors, and his painting technique. And for the latter, I was asked to contribute. And all research is also published in several essays in the accompanying exhibition catalogue, which is also available in English. You see it here on the right. I hope you can also see my cursor, I'm not sure. There are only a handful of archival documents about the life of the Dutch genre painter Pieter de Hooch. He was born and baptized in the city of Rotterdam in 1629, and he was the only surviving child of his father Hendrik, who was a bricklayer, and his mother was a midwife originally from Delft. And it remains unclear who de Hooch's artistic teachers were, though Arnold Houbraken mentions an apprenticeship with the Haarlem painter Nicolaas Bergen, which has been doubted by several scholars. De Hooch was first documented in Delft in 1652 and probably on and off working in the studio of painter Hendrik van der Burg, who, and then from 1652 to 55, which is when van der Burg, by then de Hooch's brother-in-law, moves to Leiden, and de Hooch himself registers at the Delft Painters Guild of St. Luke, an obligation for working as an independent master. In 1660 or 61, de Hooch moved to Amsterdam, which probably offered him better opportunities to sell his work, and then in the much smaller city of Delft. And the last mentioning of Pieter de Hooch is in 1679, when he has to bring his son to the asylum. A quick overview about de Hooch's oeuvre. At the beginning of his career, de Hooch paints mostly genre scenes situated in the interiors of stables and inns, and often depicting soldiers drinking and enjoying the company of female staff. And the focus is on the figures. Halfway into the 1650s, the interiors and exteriors in which the scenes are taking place seem to get a bit more importance and attention, as you can see here already in the example on the right from the Kunsthaus in Zurich. Then we move on to the Delft period. That's the late 1650s, and de Hooch created his most admired works, which are characterized by a certain harmony between space and light and the human figures. De Hooch works now with great attention to the mathematical correctness of the perspective of his exteriors, and his famous doorkijkjes or see-through, of which you can see here 3 great examples. De Hooch masterly guides the viewer's eye through his compositions by using the incidence of light and the complex arrangement of space. After relocating to Amsterdam around 1660, his compositions generally show richer interiors with darker tonalities and often more dramatic lighting, as these 3 paintings illustrate. This slide shows the research techniques that were applied during the research, that were applied and on 11 paintings. I will show them in the next slide. So we could do some in-depth study of 11 paintings. And as you can see, the research focuses on non-invasive imaging techniques, but also included cross-sectional analysis and, of course, a lot of looking with the naked eye or the stereo microscope. I can I'm sure that most of the techniques are, of course, well known, and I could maybe quickly say something about macro X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, which is maybe a little less known. I have this window here. Maybe I move this. Okay, sorry. And so that is a technique to map the elemental distribution. It can't map all the elements. Very light elements are not possible to detect, but you get an overview of which element is used where. So you can also often know which pigment was used and where. Then reflectance imaging spectroscopy is maybe also not such a well-known technique. It's sometimes also called hyperspectral imaging, but it's basically an infrared spectral technique, and you don't get all the wavelengths in one, but you get like a cube, so you have much more to choose from. And we've done that for some of the paintings in the visible to near infrared or in the short wavelength infrared. But I'll show a few of the results later on. And the good thing about the RIS is that it's complementary to macro XRF in a way that it shows molecular information. So you really get to identify the pigment, not like with macro XRF. If you have iron, you still don't know which pigment exactly. Anyway, so the research was initially focusing on the 6 paintings of de Hooch in the collection of the Rijksmuseum. You see them in the upper row. It's quite a diverse group of paintings from throughout de Hooch's career. Only one is on panel, supposedly the self-portrait of Pieter de Hooch. And next to the Rijksmuseum's paintings, we were able to perform more in-depth research, including also macro XRF imaging on 4 other paintings by de Hooch. And including the early empty glass from the Museum from Beuningen. Sorry, the family portrait from Vienna, and the courtyard from the Mauritshuis. This one is from the Kunsthalle in Karlsruhe, and this one's from a private collection. De Hooch's large oeuvre accounts for at least some sort of 200 something paintings. So to put the results of the in-depth research into broader context, I tried to gather as much technical information as possible by adding the findings of earlier publications, of course, and collection catalogues, as well as by visiting a lot of colleagues and stalking others with requests about technical information on their paintings. And all museums I contacted were very cooperative and generously shared with me whatever information they had on their de Hooch paintings. So in the end, the research included technical data from a total of 27 paintings from around the world, which you can see here. And the technical investigations resulted in a better understanding of the painter's working methods and preferences, and I'm happy to share some of the results with you. So we move on sort of through the making process of the paintings. We start with the supports, and the little graphic in the middle shows that while de Hooch initially worked more on panel, his preference shifted towards canvas in the late 1650s. The panels that were examined for this study were found to be of good quality and made of 1 or more radially cut but joined oak planks. The oak wood originated from the Baltic region, and the reverse of the panels shows beveling along all sides, as you can see here. Concerning the canvases, de Hooch used plain weave canvases like most 17th century Dutch painters, and on 2 canvases fiber analysis was performed, and they could be identified as flax, so linen. Then in at least 3 paintings, de Hooch reused a support that had already been painted on. These 2 examples here are from the artist's Delft period and on panel, but a 3rd and later painting on canvas in the Rijksmuseum in Copenhagen shows that this practice was not restricted to a certain time in the artist's careers, and also not to a certain support. So I hope you can see that here there's even 2 versions of a head And well, the painting is, well, the painting that we know now, the visit, it's called From the Met, is sort of upside down. So this was maybe a study of a male portrait, or maybe even a self-portrait. That would be really cool, but we don't know. And here you see, well, while this painting is on its side, let's say, and then you see here this face of a woman, which is probably a little bit earlier. We're coming to the preparatory layers. At first glance, great variation is visible. If you see here, look here on the right. But when grouping the paintings according to the different stages of the artist's career, some trends become apparent. Different types of support, of course, require different preparation for painting. And in the early stages of his career, de Hooch more frequently used panels to paint on. And the ground layers on 17th century Dutch panel paintings differ in composition, build-up, and layer thickness from those on canvases. And generally, the grounds on panels consist of fewer and thinner layers. And yeah, since the high quality oak panels already provide quite a smooth surface, usually a thin layer of chalk bound in glue was applied to fill the grain of the wood. A second, usually tinted or colored oil-bound ground or priming layer provided the base to paint on, which is also the case, for example, in de Hooch's early panel painting, which is titled The Empty Glass. You see it here on the left. Here, a first white chalk ground that almost exclusively fills the pores of the oak is followed by a thin, warm gray layer containing earth pigments and lead white. The canvases of de Hooch's Delft period often show light to medium gray and beige colored upper ground layers, and these consist of mixtures of slightly varying ratios of lead white, earth pigments, and fine black, as well as mixtures of chalk with small additions of earth pigments. You see here two nice examples, which are these. Other technical literature, such as collection catalogues, also mention gray and beige grounds for other of de Hooch's Delft pictures. And interestingly, the grounds de Hooch used in his Delft period show similarities in color and composition to those used by other Delft painters, including Johannes Vermeer, as well as paintings by Karel Fabricius and Jan Steen during the Delft years. This suggests that light-colored grounds of this type were commonly used by Delft painters and or their supplying primers. A greater variation in color. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, you see my emails? Yes. Okay, I hope this is back on now. A greater variation in color of the ground layers begins to occur after de Hooch had moved to Amsterdam in around 1660, 1661, and paint cross-sections from, for example, Two Women Beside a Linen Chest from 1663 show a double ground consisting of an orangey layer followed by a grayish beige, while Figures in a Courtyard Behind a House, 1663-65, exhibits a ground consisting of three layers, where an initial orange-brown ground is covered by a dark brown second ground layer and a cool gray top layer. Despite the tendency towards greater variation in ground colors, gray frequently occurs as the uppermost ground layer, at least in de Hooch's early years in Amsterdam. Further into the Amsterdam period, darker colored grounds become more frequent for de Hooch. Throughout his career, de Hooch often allowed the ground layer to play a role in the final composition. The gray and beige grounds contribute to the cool brightness of the artist's late Delft and some of the early Amsterdam paintings. And as you can see on the left in Figures in the Courtyard Behind a House, which is from 63, the gray color of the ground was, for instance, used to indicate the mortar between the bricks. You can see it here. Of the building, and for the painting on the right, which is men handing a letter to a woman from 1670, so rather late, de Hooch chose a dark orange-brown ground layer and left it exposed in many areas. for instance, in the little boy's face and headgear. The color of the ground lent an overall warm tonality to the composition, which is a characteristic feature to many of de Hooch's later paintings. After applying the ground layers, de Hooch started to neatly construct his indoor and outdoor spaces. Like many fellow contemporary artists, amongst others Vermeer, de Hooch used a string attached to a pin placed in the support at the central vanishing point. The string was then covered with chalk, tensioned, lifted up, and let snap back, leaving a line on the prepared support, which helped constructing the envisioned space. And often one can find traces of this technique, tiny pinholes in the painted surface. So like you can see it here, which is a very small area in this painting with these lifted up ridges. And sometimes you can also see them in the X-ray. Here they are very easy to find, but that's not always the case, unfortunately. As a tool to construct the spaces of his compositions, de Hooch used one point, or also called central perspective. This form of perspective requires defining a horizon line on which a central vanishing point is marked, from which consequently all vanishing lines or orthogonals emanate. Distant points necessary, for instance, to construct tile floors correctly were placed equidistant to the central vanishing point on the horizon, so here and here. And they are mostly outside the picture plane. This distance between the distant points and the central vanishing point, that's this one, dictates the position of the viewpoint and respectively in combination with the width of the picture plane, the size of the viewing angle. And when the viewing angle gets too small, the rendering of floor tiles gets unrealistic, and with the tiles seeming to somewhat fall out of the picture. So that's something the artist really didn't want. And A Mother's Duty, which is shown here, dated around 1660, is a very neat example for the correct approach. However, back in 1658, de Hooch's implementation of central perspective was not as straightforward as you can see here. You see two versions of an outside space, and the painting that is shown bigger in the center is a courtyard in Delft from the National Gallery. And the construction of the courtyard sort of follows the principles, but shows two central vanishing points, and they're even visible in the X-ray. So they were really used by de Hooch, which is of course funny because central perspective is all about one horizon and one vanishing point. And then it gets even more confusing in this painting, which I unfortunately didn't get to see myself. It's in a private collection, I think, in the UK. But if you then sort of reconstruct the perspective, there's more a vanishing area than a vanishing point, and it even seemed to be like as if he handled sort of three horizons. So it's I'm still wondering if de Hooch did do this on purpose, in a way tweaking the principles to his demands, or was he still getting acquainted to the correct use of it? The fact that after the late 1650s, de Hooch's use of perspective seems much more in control and consistent with the principles speaks maybe for the latter. After temporarily establishing the orthogonals with the pin and string technique, de Hooch constructed his spaces in more detail. And he used for this a dry medium applied with the help of a ruler. That seems to be a consistent choice and has been identified on many paintings. In this way, he delineated architectural elements such as doorways, windows, and wooden beams, as well as floor tiles and cobblestones. often the underdrawing is easily visible with the aid of infrared reflectography or even with the naked eye, such as on this painting, which has a very detailed underdrawing with neatly ruled lines. And in the center image, you can see how the diagonal lines here even run into the platform and extend into it and beyond the vertical line delineating the door on the right as well. So that's very, very funny to see. Well, more details on this nice way of underdrawing. Here, for example, you can see that while underdrawing the perspective lines, he changed his mind during painting them. You see them here, the vanishing point is here. And in this one, you also see how these really super straight lines, they end at the end of the, on the edge of the canvas. This is such an image taken with reflectance imaging spectroscopy. In this case, it's a short wavelength infrared and then in false color. And here you can really see as well how these architectural underdrawing lines run through the figures and even sort of continue down the barrel. And these were all examples for constructing spaces, all clearly done with a ruler, but for the figures, on the contrary, one can find only occasionally initial sketch lines, which are done freehand and in a fluid medium, often dark brown, but you sometimes also find like a dry medium, but there it doesn't seem to be so consistent. So here, this is the tip of her shoe peeking out from the skirt, but then in the initial sketch, this shoe is painted. And here you see a bit the same also for that stool. And the used medium seems to be more difficult to visualize with the available techniques. So we're coming to the paint layers and the artist's palette, and all these pigments could be identified in paintings by de Hooch. All pigments are commonly used by Dutch 17th century painters. Maybe a bit more uncommon is green earth and indigo. That was also as well only found exclusively in the late A Man Handing a Letter to a Woman, which is from 1670. Now we come to the bricks that also gave my talk the title. And de Hooch's rendering of buildings and especially of brick walls reveal a sharp, observant eye. As mentioned, his father was a bricklayer, and well, so yeah, it's a bit tempting to think that this influenced him or that made him more aware of the importance of walls and all the different ways of painting them. He also makes big differences between weathered walls and this very neat wall, for example. And in this neat house, he individually painted brick by brick with separate horizontal brush strokes. And first he even has underdrawn all these lines, and then all these little brush strokes that are about 1 centimeter, so you can really nicely see them in the Marco XRF obtained elemental map for Mercury. So they're very separate and super straight. And then he came back. So this is just the ground, but then he had to come back with this white highlights again, sort of to paint the mortar. So this wasn't a quick job. We're getting to ultramarine, and this blue pigment extracted from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli and known for its stability and intense blue color was by far the most expensive pigment on de Hooch's palette. Nevertheless, the artist seems to have used it in almost all paintings examined for this study, and the quality of the ultramarine differs, as is documented by a varying particle size and the presence of accessory minerals. Often de Hooch used ultramarine in important, larger blue areas, such as in the skirts of the female figures, like here, or in this skirt. But additionally, de Hooch used ultramarine also to accentuate little details, like the embellishment around the waist of the child and woman and child in the pantry, and the little decorations on the Delft blue tiles. And 2 women beside a linen chest. They were also painted in ultramarine. And ultramarine was not only used by de Hooch for brilliant blues, but also in paint mixtures, for example, mixed with red lake and purple glazes on tiles. So that's in this example, in the floor, and also with yellow and earth pigments to create green, for example, for foliage, as you see here. We're also continuing with these 2 trees, which are depicted in figures in a courtyard, and they have a very different color. The foreground tree, which is here, looks rather bluish, while the tree in the background has a brownish appearance. And the macro XRF obtained an elemental distribution map of cobalt, which is here in the middle, indicates the use of smalt. And the foliage of both trees seem to contain smalt, yet the background tree shows much more intense signal, as you can see here. And macro XRF is not able to detect ultramarine, as the elements contained are too light to be detected with this technique. However, reflectance imaging spectroscopy, and in this case in the visible to near infrared region, is able to map the use of ultramarine. And as you can see on the right, it becomes apparent that the foreground tree, this one, shows many depths of ultramarine containing paint, while the background tree, which is sort of here, does not. And the study of 2 paint cross sections taken one of both trees confirms this observation. The foliage of the foreground tree was built up much more complex, with an initial layer of ultramarine and earth pigment, which is layer number 4, followed by a thicker layer of smalt, yellow lake, and a mixture of earth pigments. That's layer number 5. And this layer was locally followed by a mixture of ultramarine mixed with lead white and probably some yellow lake to add definition and variation to the greenery, which is layer number 6. And additionally, but not included in the sample, de Hooch finished with tiny highlights of lead white and Latin yellow. Yellow lake is light fugitive, of course, and has notably faded, leaving the greenery with a bluish hue, and instead of the intended more greenish color. And as you can see in the cross-section below, which is this set of cross-sections, the background tree shows a much simpler buildup with basically 1 thick layer of mostly smalt, and this tree now appears brownish due to the heavily discolored thick layer of smalt, so there's like almost no blue visible anymore. Pieter de Hooch occasionally used some beautiful little tricks while painting, like incisions for defining the tiles on the wall, which you can see here. And he also does that sometimes with these perspective lines, the orthogonals, and which creates a very nice 3D effect. But in this case, he also scratched this little crack into the wet paint. In a woman and a child in a pantry, de Hooch's monogram, but also areas of the tile floor are painted with a deep brown paint, probably Kassel earth. And this medium rich brown paint was applied on top of an already rather dry paint film, causing the paint to reticulate. And this effect can be observed in several paintings of de Hooch, and the beading seems a deliberately created effect to depict, for instance, dirt on tiles. So here you can see that they form all these small little beads, but also these lines are with the same paint. And of course the monogram. We arrived at the last subject of my talk, which is changes to the composition. And given the numerous, often major changes the artist made to his compositions during painting, it seems likely that de Hooch developed his conceptions directly on the canvas, probably with the aid of sample drawings or compositional elements. And although no drawing of de Hooch, or no drawings of de Hooch are known, the frequent repetition of certain figures, but also of architectural features, lends support to this. Here we can see a funny little change. If you kind of carefully look at the roof, you can here count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines of roof tiles, and that's many more. I think it's 13 on this side. So probably when doing this sort of underpaint, he felt the house looked too small, or that's at least sort of what I get the idea. So if these roof tiles, or if there are more rows, the house slightly looks bigger. So that's a rather small change. Another nice change is here in the empty glass, and we can see that the head of the soldier initially was shown more in profile. You can see it probably best in the Vermilion or in the Mercury map Macro XRF obtained, but you can also see both faces in the LED map. So the current face where he's turning a bit towards us, and the original, or the initial one, not original, initial one, because both are by de Hooch, looking towards the maidservant. A larger compositional change is visible in A Mother's Duty. In the Macro XRF LED distribution map, you can clearly see a now discarded woman is standing behind the figure of the mother from the current composition, which is here. It stayed unclear, though, during the last treatment of the painting in the 1980s, what that shape was to the right of the standing woman here. Obviously not belonging to the current composition of the mother delousing her child. And they settled back then with the idea that it was probably a cradle. And through Macro XRF scanning, we were able to identify also the shape on the right. And it is a figure of a sitting man with one leg stretched out, as you can see best in a Macro XRF iron map on the right. I hope you can see that's his foot. This is his head, his face, one arm, second arm, hard to see. These are his shoulders. And through Macro XRF, we also receive information about the color scheme of this discarded couple. For the female figure, this is easier than for the male figure. Clearly, she was wearing a white cap and collar, a red skirt. This is the Mercury map. And then a blue hitched up apron, which was painted in with smalt. And her blouse was mostly painted in iron-containing pigment, which of course could be several colors. And as a matter of fact, this just described figure of a maidservant is actually a well-known regular in paintings of de Hooch from his Delft period. You can see here, well, this is actually the same one, but mirrored. But there are, well, actually she's mirrored, she's original, and this one is in Karlsruhe. These two are in the National Gallery in London. So they follow obviously a pattern, and also this male figure, and for sure his position is kind of, looks familiar. And as many of de Hooch's works, also A Mother's Duty is undated, but this finding strongly connects the painting with de Hooch's Delft period, which these examples come from. At the same time, though, the room in which the scene takes place, and de Hooch painted this or sort of the same room several times, also connects the painting clearly to de Hooch's Amsterdam period. It seems the mother's duty forms a bridge between both stages of the artist's career, which makes a dating of the painting around 1660-61, the time that de Hooch relocated to Amsterdam, very likely. Well, with this, I'm at the end of my talk. I hope I have given you some insights into Pieter de Hooch's way of working. I want to do a big thank you also to all the people listed here, and especially to Dina, who is a paintings conservator at the National Gallery in Washington and became my de Hooch pal through all the research she had done. And well, thank you for your attention. I hope there's people still there, so sure.
They are.
I feel a bit alone here in my study.
And we have some applause going.
Oh yeah, I see that. Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
Yes. Now, does anybody have any questions? Okay, we have a question from.
Oh, should I be doing something, reading as well?
Yes. No. Would you explain again how Pieter de Hooch created the beading of the paint as on the tiles?
Oh yeah. Well, in theory, you would have this very binding medium rich, organic brown paint, the Kossel earth. And for example, with his monogram, he would do that at the end, and also the division of the tiles to some extent. So the idea is that it doesn't really adhere so well to that paint layer underneath, which must have dried already to some extent, or oxidized to some extent, so that it sort of forms these little beads, so it reticulates and just sort of connects to each other and creates this very nice effect. Is that clear? Sure.
Okay. From Henry.
And I also didn't try it myself. Maybe I should. Well, always good.
It's not always successful.
No, not at all.
Were these genre pieces? Okay. Are you able to genre pieces painted as commissions? And is there any supporting documentation on the clients?
For de Hooch, there's none. Since I'm not an art historian, I wouldn't dare. Probably there's all that can also be a commission. I'm quite sure that's possible. I have to. It's don't feel like I can answer that question correctly. But for de Hooch, I'm sure there's no commissions. We know from some archival sources in the 17th century, also in Delft, who people who had paintings by de Hooch, but not about commissions. But there was one, somehow collector who had many paintings by him. You can of course also think of a commission, but I'm not aware. For de Hooch, for sure not, but probably for others.
So in certain ways, they were painted more speculatively to sell to whoever would buy them. Yeah, I think probably both. I mean, it's also often humorous and of course moralizing. So it's fun probably also to have in your house. No. Yes. I don't think we have any more questions. What a wonderful talk. And I will say now that we're not letting you escape because you'll be back in about 11 months talking to us about Vermeer. So as you can see, we have lots more applause. Oh, yeah, I can see on some party emoticon. Well, I hope. Well, it's kind of funny because I can't see any of the audience. I hope you enjoyed it and it wasn't too much or too little. And if you have any questions, please contact me. Oh, hang on, there is just one more hang on. Oh, just a big thank you.
Oh, that's very
Rebecca
nice.
Moyson.
Well, thank you for
Okay.
listening.
Thank you.